I want love to mean that we fight for what is good and true and just with our eyes wide open. I want care to mean we take responsibility for ourselves, our choices, each other. I want home to be a place where no questions are unbroachable.
I want that too.
I think we all do. And the fact that we created an entire society that denied that is remarkable.
So wild.
So powerful. Powerful.
You see why I wanted her on this show so badly.
Oh, gosh, yes. Gosh, yes. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Love Letters to the Future. I'm PJ Manny, and
this is Love Letters to the Future. I'm your co-host, Laura Faye Tenenbaum, and we are so glad you're here. And I'm actually intimidated by our guest today because I'm a fangirl. So I'm just being honest with you. I love her writing and I love her work so much, and I'm sure you're going to love her too. Her name is Emily Strasser, and we are so glad you all are joining us for this special episode.
We're very excited to have Emily here on the show because her work holds so many old myths and recognizing new myths in so many aspects of history, science, family relationships, that she really encapsulates this idea that we try to get across on our show, that what we think reality is, what we think the state of the world, our backgrounds, the very belief systems we hold might not be real. They may be a story that we've been told that isn't either accurate or is actually hurting us. So, Emily, welcome. This is a fantastic opportunity to deconstruct these stories.
I just want to jump in and say that her first book is called Half-Life of a Secret, Reckoning with a Hidden History. It's a memoir, and it traces her journey reckoning with the legacy of her grandfather's work, which is building nuclear weapons and enriching uranium for the atomic bomb. This book won the 2024 Reed Environmental Writing Award and the 2024 Minnesota Book Award. Emily was also the presenter of the 2020 BBC podcast, The Bomb. She has an MFA in creative writing and teaches journalism and creative writing at Tufts University. So I just want to give you a little background about her. And I think we should just start the questions with this idea of secrets. And while most people who are listening to this podcast now may or may not have a family member who worked on a secret atomic bomb, but I think almost everybody has this old myth, as PJ would call it, of secrets. I think it's not on purpose secrets that our families hold. I think it's just an old tradition that people don't talk about stuff. And that was one of my favorite parts about the book, was just this embracing of these are difficult things. It's time to talk about them. So welcome, Emily. Let's start there.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here. You would be surprised, actually, how many people do have a nuclear scientist in the family.
I would be surprised, actually.
That's a little bit of a side note, but I always joke in whatever talk I give that someone's going to have an Oak Ridge connection or someone's going to have a Manhattan Project connection, and it usually happens. And if it's not that, it's like, oh, they worked on something else that like is violent that I am reckoning with, or like,
wow,
there's just half a million people worked on the Manhattan Project. People don't know that it was so big because all we hear about are, Oppenheimer and Leo Szilard and the famous people, the sort of dozens of famous scientists. But, you needed a huge number of people like to sweep floors and people to be nurses in the hospitals in these secret cities they set up for this massive production project. You needed teachers to teach their kids. You needed secretaries, right? So I guess I say that to say that my family story starts out sounding a little bit remarkable, but I agree with what you said, Laura, that it's in some ways not that remarkable, right? We're all just tied to so many industries that are violent and extractive in this country, or this world, and also and cultures that haven't always handled difficult things in a healthy way. So
sure. Would you agree with my original premise that environmental degradation, damage, extraction is on purpose hidden? Whereas, like, the fact that your family doesn't talk about difficult things is just a default that perhaps needs to be changed. And with your book and your generation and your life story, you are talking about the hard things.
Certainly, yeah, there's a difference between, deliberate withholding information from the public that you know will be a problem and sort of habitual secrecy. I mean, part of what my book is about is also the intersection of the personal and political, and like how does living and working in a place where you're not allowed to talk about your work also impact that you're not allowed to talk about your mental health, right? Or like how does practicing one kind of compartmentalization that's instituted from above, that says to have your job, you have to like only know so much and only say so much, like seep into another part of your life. So I totally agree with you. Yeah, that it's like there's a habitual secrecy that certain generations have had more than others. We're lucky to be in a time where there's less stigma around some of these things.
But it's not luck. It's like you're actually doing the work.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Take some credit. Talk about what it's like to be the first person to like dig and find the truth, and like what was in you, what came inside your being that said, I'm not going to self-silence anymore.
I mean, I think I've always been interested in stories and in home. I was a kid who was very like close to my family, really loved my family, loved this place. The book centers a lot around my grandmother's house in East Tennessee, which is where my grandparents retired after my grandfather retired from the nuclear weapons plant in Oak Ridge. And I've also always been entangled with this question of like, what is it to be a good person and to live a good life? And those two questions kind of collided. That love and that question collided as I sort of came into adulthood when I was sort of starting to graduate college, and it all came up in a whole tangled mess. Right, there was never any separation from like the questions of the personal and the family, and the questions of the political. I wonder if it would be helpful to give a little bit of context.
Please, yes, please.
So the way the book begins is with my memory of my grandfather standing in front of what I later was able to say was a nuclear test blast, a photograph that hung in my grandmother's house when I was growing up, or so I remembered. It wasn't a thing that was really explained or contextualized at all in my family. And in college, I started to remember this photograph with this sort of sudden haunting feeling. And along with that, I also started to think about this grandfather who died before I was born, who I'd never known, and remember that there were things about him that we didn't say much about, that I sort of always had this sense of like, yes, I knew that there were some mental health things that were always kind of, like stated briefly and clinically, and then moved on from. So I was started to ask these questions at the same time. Who was this man? What was this work he did? Why the heck do we have this photograph? Like, what is this all about? What does it mean for this to be an origin story of my family?
So you kind of took it personally in a way. Your family participated in this violence. I had asked you to prepare a couple of words that you could read from the book to just give us an example of a secret, and it could either be the family secret, or it could be the political secret of how there was a on purpose withholding of information from the public that was dangerous.
Definitely. I need to give a little context because I'm not going to read a long passage. When I was researching the history of Oak Ridge, which was this secret city that was built in East Tennessee for the purpose of enriching uranium for the first atomic bomb. So there were 70,000 people living there at the height of construction. Yet they knew only as much as they needed to know to complete their jobs, which means that like more than 90%, right, have no idea. They're just doing a war job. They don't know they're building an atomic bomb. They know
that is wild. Can I just say how wild that is?
It is. Oh, it's completely wild. I mean, they literally learned what they were doing when Truman announces the bombing of Hiroshima over the radio.
Wow.
And so people are like pouring into the streets. They're like, this is what's going on. Some people are alarmed because they're like, we were told not to talk about this. Like, why are you talking about it? And it's like, Truman's talking about it.
That's insane.
So it's pretty wild. And so part of what I trace is also like following, what does it mean for this like sort of national policy, right, to become internalized in a place and in families? But one of The episodes I uncovered when I was researching this history was about a really sort of awful thing. So they were concerned at the time about the health effects of radiation, right? There hadn't
As
been...
well they should be.
As well they should be, but they didn't know nearly as much as we do now. Of course, they're didn't keep them from exposing people to it, right? People are doing the work, and in real time, they're like, maybe we better know more about this. So they started doing human radiation experiments on people without their consent or knowledge. And the very first of these was in Oak Ridge, and it was what happened is a black man who was a cement worker was in a car accident, and he was taken to the Oak Ridge Hospital, and he had broken his legs, and they waited to set his bones, and they got a vial of plutonium and injected him with plutonium.
What the fuck?
Yeah, it's a really, really gut-turning episode. And then they didn't tell him anything, and they let him check out, and he went on to live his life and died later of a heart attack. So this is right. That's deliberate secret keeping, right? Keeping from him, keeping from the other doctors, and
the worst of the worst.
The worst of the worst. Yeah, the worst of the worst. At a time when, right, where the story, the mythos, right, of World War II is we're on the right side. This is the righteous fight. The Nazi doctors are doing terrible things, right? But what makes, what makes this different? So that's the background of the chapter I'm going to read, and just the little section. So I have a part where I talk about how when this case finally came to light, there was some little game of hot potato with the blame, right? One doctor's like, well, I didn't do it. I just did it on orders from this person. And then this person is like, well, no, I wasn't even there. Someone else did, right? They're just kind of shifting it around. But then I'm kind of moving out and saying, okay, but what does it mean when you move out from this direct line of responsibility? How do we think about this? But this is not the story of the doctors and researchers who knew about, advocated for, and performed the injections on Ebcade and the others. This is not the story of the scientists who knew what it meant to build an atomic bomb, the generals who chose the targets, or the pilots who flew the planes. It is the story of the air around them, of the ordinary people who didn't know, who didn't ask, who looked away. Because serving well, meant sticking to your business, meant cultivating a lack of curiosity about the work, about the town, about the lives of those unlike you. It meant sacrificing for a righteous fight while ignoring the injustices at your doorstep. While the propaganda signs in Oak Ridge prompted residents to imagine the sufferings of soldiers on faraway battlefields, compartmentalization taught them not to extend such empathy to their neighbors. Oak Ridge was also very, very horribly segregated. Even for the standards of the time, it was quite bad. Later, as a result of the segregation that rendered the lives of black residents invisible, or of simple denial, many white residents would claim ignorance of the conditions endured by their black counterparts. In his memoir, published 7 years after the war, General Leslie Groves, the Army Corps officer who oversaw the entire project, described the advantages of compartmentalization. Quote, adherence to this rule not only provided an adequate measure of security, but it greatly improved overall efficiency by making our people stick to their knitting.
Wow.
And then I'm just going to skip ahead.
Can I just add something?
Yeah.
We did literally the last episode we recorded, we were talking about efficiency and how that is an old way of doing things that seems to keep people and nature and even our relationship with ourselves separated. So obviously that's a perfect example of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just justify everything in the name of
efficiency.
Yeah, of efficiency.
Yeah. So that's definitely an old story.
So I'll just read a little bit more. Is that okay?
Sure.
In my family, only one anecdote has survived from the day Oak Ridge learned of the bombing of Hiroshima. Ma'am, my grandmother's boss reportedly told my pregnant grandmother after they'd heard the news, your baby will be born in peacetime. 9 days later, on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, and the formal agreement that officially ended World War II was signed 2 weeks after that. My Aunt Karen was born in November. These were potent beginnings. In Mima's drawers upstairs at the lake house, my grandmother, I found a tiny black and white picture of her standing with a group of 11 other women, all white, holding their infants and toddlers. From her penciled note on the back, I gathered that this photograph was taken in February of 1946, when my Aunt Karen was 3 months old. These children are the pre-boomers, conceived before the assurance of peace but born in the blissful months after the war ended. The woman's hair is coiffed and curled into soft, bouncy waves, and they wear straight-cut suit dresses and bold lipstick. Only about half look at the camera. The other half are engaged in trying to get their squirming, crying, or sleeping babies to look up. Psychology tells us that our earliest lives instill patterns, fears, and insecurities we may not even be able to remember or articulate. What did those babies, wriggling in their mother's arms, learn of silence before they could even speak? A father at a dinner table, brooding on some incident at the plant. A spill, maybe, or a technical puzzle, or his own nagging suspicion that he knows what they are building. Or a nurse who's noticed something strange about the treatment of a black cement mixer, who knows 3 weeks is too long to leave bones unset, who feels in her gut what she will not speak even to herself. Or the wife cooped up at home with the baby, only rumors and her own imagination for company, because in this town even gossip, even guesses are policed. And so there's just the click of silverware on ceramic, the smacking of lips, the rustle of napkins.
That's phenomenal.
PJ, did the hair stand up on the back of your neck during that?
Absolutely.
Mine too. So I think just to kind of summarize where we're at, we've talked a little bit about the issues with withholding information within inside of a family. We've talked about withholding knowledge and information more broadly, environmentally. We've talked about the damage it causes to individual people, to groups of people. Did you want to make any comments about environmental issues? Because your knowledge is massive on whole ecosystem impacts of this behavior.
I mean, if you talk about efficiency, like there was a very, not an untrue sort of urgency about the Manhattan Project, right? There was a credible fear that Germany was well on their way to building an atomic bomb. And you can agree or disagree that that was a justifiable reason to develop it, but like a lot of the scientists involved really believed that, and they believed that they were doing it for the purpose of beating Germany. So there was this big rush. And in the name of that, a lot of corners were cut, and there were also things they didn't yet understand. And then that urgency just gets extended into the Cold War, right? Then you have another story about why we need to rush. So we get into the Cold War, and I just have this enormous push to produce as many weapons as fast as possible. And during that time, one of the things my grandfather worked on was lithium isotope separation, which was an important fuel component for thermonuclear hydrogen bombs, which are way more powerful than the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That process required a ton of mercury, which is very, very hard to work with. It was very, very heavy, and it was breaking through pipes, pooling in the floor, collecting in the walls. There are stories of workers wading through mercury up to their boot tops. This was not a subtle problem, right? This isn't just something that they were like, we didn't realize that it was leaking. No, it's totally crazy. And then they were also venting the buildings because mercury is dangerous to breathe. So they knew that breathing it in was dangerous to the workers. This went on for years, and then it was in the 1960s. This was in the 1950s to 1960s. They shut down the process because they had enriched all the lithium we needed. Like, we didn't need any more lithium, so they stopped, not because they were worried about leaking more mercury. And it wasn't for, sorry, I have a cat visitor here.
This episode is Attack of the Cats.
Attack of the Cats. It wasn't until the 70s and then the 80s that this stuff started to come to light by the public. It starts with, a dogged journalist who submits a Freedom of Information Act request. There's a scientist who at one of the other labs in Oak Ridge who hears about some rumors about the mercury, and he goes in with his little sample, to collect some samples and tests the mercury, and he's just run out of his job because they don't want anyone to know. And finally, it really comes to public light, and there's a congressional hearing about it in 1983. And that sets off a whole process. It's, you pull at that one thing and then you discover all the other stuff that was coming out. Mercury was still one of the biggest problems, but there was, all kinds of toxic chemicals and radioactive material that was also being released, of course, or buried improperly, or just unaccounted for. They don't know what happened. And that sets up a whole process until Oak Ridge is ultimately named a Superfund site in 1989.
So what's the impact on the environment? I know as the cat is climbing all over your head, there's people, right? And we could talk about what the impact was on people's social, psychological, physical reality, but there's also an entire environment with lakes and rivers and air and plants and wild animals. What I'm sure you know what some of the impact has been.
I mean, so basically then there was just like in the 90s and early 2000s, the public were very alarmed. Clearly, like understandably, there were definitely people who had chronic conditions that were attributable to these exposures. Also in the plant, right? You get a higher exposure if you're working inside these facilities. And a lot of concerned residents, and there was a sort of a time of a lot of political activity around this, of monitoring. There were public health studies. The workers and residents kind of worked together, and eventually the Energy Employees Occupational Illness Compensation Act got passed, and which gave former nuclear workers a way to get compensation for health harm. Although, I mean, how can you really compensate for like a lifelong disability? But it was some acknowledgement. The residents, there was never anything for them. Of the people I spoke to, former activists, sick workers, some scientists who had worked on some of these health studies, there are varying perceptions of like how bad it was or is. But there was sort of an agreement about the frustration of the process, that certain things were maybe understated for like political reasons and not cleaned up to the standards that they should have been. How people interact with the environment now depends a lot on their position. That conversation has like mostly subsided. I mean, there's still a lot of active cleanup work going on, and there's still a big, complicated Superfund site. They still do sampling in, spiders and bats and bugs. And there's an annual deer hunt where they test deer on the reservation for radiation. And they're not turning up huge numbers. It's like maybe there's one or two. Some years there's none. But the fact that there's any is, different than maybe your standard deer hunt.
That's wild. Can I just interject something here? I want to just ensure our listeners.
Yeah.
This is Love Letters to the Future. We've done a lot of conversation about the past and how things do need to change. And I do want to ensure people that we are going to get to a more like forward thinking before they kind of go and sob in a corner.
Yeah.
So I do promise that we are. And so let me just ask two questions, or one question for both of you. PJ and Emily, is there some other major topic, because we could be going on how negative things are in the past for a long time, but I do want to start to shift over into the what do we think should happen in the future. Yeah. But before we just whiplash into, is there something else that we really important, either PJ to ask or Emily to like, that you really need people to hear about some of the stuff that happens that we need to think about maybe redoing a better way, and then we'll shift.
Well, Emily, actually, I put this back to you because you have recently, in the last couple of years, talked about how we talk about things like environmentalism, what's the framing, what's the story. I think there's a lot there that leads to this better way of thinking about framing stories and myths that will eventually be made about the environment, about climate, about humans' interaction with it. Can you explore that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would not end with, but start with, you have to tell the hard stories. You have to unearth these things, whether they're in the family or they're in the ground, right? Like, you don't get anywhere by ignoring that there's a toxic waste burial ground, whether or not that's a metaphoric waste burial ground or not, right? Like
all of the above.
Yeah. Like the metaphors are sort of too obvious.
The metaphors metaphor themselves, don't they?
Yeah. You have to be able to stand on something true and honest. And
that's right.
I think sometimes we're so afraid of the darkness or of the pain that we don't even want to look at it. And I get it. It is hard.
I say that all the time, though, about the climate crisis, that ignoring it isn't a solution. And how do we find the strength, the courage, the fortitude to stand and witness it and feel everything that we feel and still find meaning in everything that we're losing.
I completely agree. And this is, I mean, this is how Laura and I met, was talking about climate feelings, basically.
Climate emotions, yes.
Yeah. And I think maybe a hopeful thing that I discovered in the writing of the book is that you can underestimate people like I did. I thought there are certain people who I spoke to, including in my family, who I was so scared about, like, what it would feel like for them to unearth some of this. And actually, for the most part, I was received with so much like grace and gratitude, and people, like, some people, it felt like they were waiting to be asked, right? Like,
Wow.
sometimes
Wow.
we want to talk about the hard things. I mean, I also teach a class about writing about climate change. My undergraduates also have feelings, and sometimes it's helpful to write about those things.
I cannot tell you how many people have told me, oh, maybe make it more positive, maybe put a spin. And it's just like, I totally agree with what you're saying. It's like just painting over something and covering it up with a smiley face. Then you're just repressing your own emotions and they're coming out in all these other...
Right? Like, you don't believe the smile because you know that it's covering something up.
Even more than that, Joyce Carol Oates says the best writing comes from writing the taboo. The thing that people are trying to avoid, that's where the best writing in the world comes from.
Of course. And is it that the people don't want to talk about it, or is it there's some dumb societal rule that we're
It's
not
a myth.
supposed to? And exactly. So everybody, if you've been taught this dumb societal rule that you're supposed to keep your emotions hidden inside and not feel them, that somehow they'll go away, that's something that we need to let go of. Because as Emily just said, if you yourself are wanting, and I'm talking to Emily, if Emily wants to feel her emotions and your students are saying, yeah, I actually, and you said your family that you were afraid to talk to about this because you thought that they were going to resist, actually were relieved when they finally had permission to put down the fake smiley face bullshit pretend life and be real.
We don't know what's on the other side of grief or fear or anxiety until we go through it, right?
Yeah.
And actually, sometimes it's really powerful, what we find on the other side. Maybe we have capacities we didn't know we had. There is also joy on the other side. Like, I'm not saying we need to just like live in despair. We shouldn't.
That's kind of a perfect segue to the fact that in her book, Emily writes about going to the 70th anniversary of the dropping of the bomb in the two cities in Japan where the bomb was dropped. So do you want to talk about that, Emily? I know I asked you to perhaps bring something to read on that subject. It's pretty profound. Before you read, maybe just say about like just the idea that you said, my grandfather built this bomb, you said to yourself, and now I want to go to these cities. And like, tell us about that process.
I mean, I knew from the beginning that I needed to go. Like, it just was sort of clear if I was going to take this project seriously, that would have to be part of it. I was pretty nervous about it, pretty scared, like of how I would be received and what it would bring up for me emotionally. It certainly wasn't the first thing I did. I waited till I was some years into the project and then eventually went. And even as I was going, I was sort of questioning myself, like, what does it mean for me to go here? Am I witnessing? Am I atoning? But atoning like seems to imply that I can make something right, whereas my presence isn't like getting rid of nuclear weapons in this world. I'm not, under illusions that, I'm not like some American official, right, who has the power to change our nuclear policy. Nevertheless, I knew it was important for me to go. It was painful, but it was also very powerful. I met, a number of Hibakusha atomic bomb survivors who tell their stories again and again and again because, recount the worst thing that we could probably imagine. Certainly the worst day of their lives, but for the sake of the hope that this won't happen to other people, for a political purpose. So encountering that kind of like resistance and resilience and generosity was powerful. And they were very generous in how they received me as well. And for that, I'm grateful. I know you asked me to read part from Hiroshima. The part I found that feels like it's more clearly about this question of the what is not from Hiroshima.
Okay. I think one myth we can dispel right now is that podcast hosts have to control everything.
Exactly.
Okay, great.
That one's pretty easy. I'll let go of that.
I think the only context you need here is that Nellie is my youngest aunt, the youngest of 4 children of my grandparents, and she was the youngest one left at home when my grandfather's mental health was the worst, so bore the brunt of a lot of hard experiences. She's the one that I was sort of most nervous about. What would this bring up for her, to ask her about this, and did I have any right? That's all the context you need to know. In one of the sociological studies I read about Oak Ridge, an activist recounted how a friend had ended a conversation on local contamination. Quote, she said in a shaky voice, "I don't want to hear this. I don't need to know this. I am stuck here. This is where I have to live. This is the end of the conversation." I recognized my own impulse in the woman's panicked response. How many times have I wanted to stop asking questions, to take someone else's word for it? I do not want to have to live inside all of this knowledge with all of this scared uncertainty. I understand why Oak Ridgers, out of pride or self-protectiveness, talk around certain stories. We live in our minds more than our houses, and none of us want to be guilty or sick. Ghosts, as the lore goes, linger when unfinished business ties us to this earth. Guilt, betrayal, or great suffering condemns them to circle the sites of their most traumatic moments. But maybe the living too get stuck. We shut our minds on the truth we cannot bear to face, board up our hearts against suffering we cannot admit, both our own and that of others. A woman once told me that sore throats were symptoms of unexpressed desires. At the time, I thought it was a nice metaphor. Now, I think it's literally true. The muscles of our jaws and throats straining against what we cannot let out. We fear that truth will force us to give up what is most precious. But why must love mean love without question? Why must loyalty require blind acceptance? George, my grandfather, lingered for years after his death, Nellie told me. She sensed his presence intuitively. When lights went on and off, or she'd walk into a room and the TV would turn on, she knew it was George. "You're going to think I'm a fruitcake," she laughed when she told me. It wasn't a scary presence, though, but a benevolent one. Sometimes she had vivid dreams as if she were awake. She'd open her eyes to find her father standing at the end of her bed. "You're dead," she'd inform him. "Well, I know," he'd respond. "I want you to take care of Mom. I really need you to get in touch with Mom. I don't think she's doing well." Nellie would wake feeling buoyant, transcendent, quote, like the first time you're in love. For weeks after each dream, she'd fall asleep, yearning to slip into that luminous space again. Nellie, of all of her siblings, was injured most profoundly by her father's instability. She saw the worst of what he was, and yet now she seems to be able to hold the most vivid and complicated view of him. He was a tortured man, she says, sympathetic without excusing him. And though I feared what pain my questioning might unearth, Nellie has never been hurt or angry or defensive in response to my probing of the family's past. She has been grateful to speak of what there has never been much room to say. I want love to mean that we fight for what is good and true and just with our eyes wide open. I want care to mean we take responsibility for ourselves, our choices, each other. I want home to be a place where no questions are unbroachable.
I want that too.
I think we all do. And the fact that we created an entire society that denied that is remarkable.
So wild.
So powerful. Powerful.
You see why I wanted her on this show so badly.
Oh, gosh, yes. Gosh, yes. If you were to make a list, I mean, that's actually the beginning of a list of how do we tell better stories, share better information. Transparency and love are right at the top of those lists for you, it sounds like.
Yeah, definitely.
Are there other aspects of what you encountered where you felt these were values that were raised to societal demands that you feel aren't serving us?
What a great question. I haven't been asked this before. It's because of your framing. One that comes to mind is compartmentalization, right? And this is like, sure, that was the official security policy in Oak Ridge, but it's much bigger than that.
Yeah, you see it everywhere in
Right.
medicine. You
Exactly.
see it
Everywhere.
Yeah.
in psychology, in
In
societies,
business.
in business. Yeah, even like
Yeah.
home and work has to be separate. And
Exactly.
where
Yeah.
where the opposite would, of course, be wholeness.
Right, exactly. The idea that anything is not political, the idea that there is such a thing as, like, that there's separation between anything, right? This is why it takes me a long time to write, because I'm like, this story about, a toilet paper roll is the story of everything, right? Like, everything is everything. And so it takes forever. So I think in the book was sort of an effort to write against compartmentalization. The idea that, like, Ebcade, right, this black man who was injected with plutonium in Oak Ridge, never knew my grandfather, or as far as I know, I think it would be unlikely that they would have ever met. And yet, like, they're relevant to each other. We learn something about the other from them.
Well, even when you think about writing any book, or I read so many books, and it's like, what's the book about? Well, mine's a memoir, and it stays in this tiny little lane.
Right.
Or this is a science nonfiction, and you have to stay in this little lane. And one of the things that I love about your writing so much is the interweaving of the personal with the much broader world, and I think that's a really, really important message to pass on to, like, now and moving forward. Can we weave the personal in with the broader? Always, not just sometimes. Can we?
Right.
Always?
We all have a stake, and every kind of objectivity is a myth, right? That's a myth.
Right. There you go.
Not that, like, again, don't get me wrong, the desire for fairness in journalism is absolutely important. The scientific method is important, right? I'm not bashing any of that, but, like, what gets funded in science is political, right? Why do we know less about women's health than we know about men's health? How we interpret results depends on what assumptions we come to them with.
Exactly.
I want more expansive stories that make the connection between places that are across the world from each other, between things that seem mundane that aren't. I want interdisciplinary stories, right? Like, I want
Amen.
all the stuff in the same
Amen.
bucket.
Me too. I love interdisciplinary.
Yeah.
Some of your work now is on communicating about the doomsday clock. Some of the essays I've read about that, you've been able to do what we're just talking about, incorporate the personal, the political, the smaller individual, the larger group, and more. What kind of interdisciplinary truths are you bringing into those kinds of stories?
What you're referring to, I wrote a piece that came out in December about the doomsday clock, sort of going deep behind the scenes of the doomsday clock. And if your listeners aren't familiar with it, the doomsday clock is a sort of metaphoric clock whose hands are set by a board of scientists and other experts as an indication of how close the world is to human-inflicted annihilation, basically, or destruction. The clock has existed since 1947 and was the project of the Bulletin of Atomic Science, which was a group of former Manhattan Project scientists who wanted to raise the alarm about the threat of nuclear weapons. And it has evolved over time, but it used to only indicate nuclear threat. And in 2007, they added climate change, and now it also includes, like, disruptive technology and biorisks. So its indication sort of is like a holistic, it's not a mathematical, it's a holistic kind of measure of this group of experts' assessment on how precarious, how dangerous things are. So I've been kind of fascinated with it for a long time. Went deep behind the scenes to try to understand, like, how is it set? What does it mean? And also to the interdisciplinary, like, who does it? What I was really interested in is, like, what does it mean to be a human doing this work? Like, how do you do it? And what is the toll it takes?
I think you're asking yourself what the toll it is taking on you. And maybe I know this too, just because I'm guessing, or we've talked about it a little bit, but you're also concerned with the toll that it's taking on you personally, doing all this hard research and the impact on you and your own joy in the world and your own grief about the world. And how do you personally go through the life knowing what you know about the world?
Yeah, it can get heavy for sure. Not like advocating compartmentalization, but taking breaks is, like, important. We don't, like, live there all the time. I guess one of the places where I found goodness in, like, studying the doomsday clock and talking to the people involved, the idea of possibility, and I think this is maybe misunderstood, and this may be a communication thing that they need to work out, right? But it may feel like inevitable, like the clock is marching forward, right? But actually the thing is they move it back and forth, or in theory. It hasn't moved back for a long time, but that's the goal.
When you say a long time, how long?
I think it's been steadily forward. I would have to double check, since 2010. The point is, actually, none of these guys, like, it was kind of freeing for me to be like, you guys aren't predictors, right? You're not like predictors of the future. I mean, they don't pretend to be, but sometimes people think that they pretend to be. This feels like an accurate measure of alarm to me. I feel alarmed, but also, we don't know what the tipping points are, good or bad, right? Like, that's the thing about tipping points. We didn't know that, like, Greta Thunberg, like, having a solo protest, right, as a high schooler, was going to set off a youth global climate movement. We didn't know that Minneapolis was going to, like, it wasn't inevitable one way or the other how that city was going to respond.
It's not inevitable what's going to happen now.
In the space of possibility, in the time before midnight, like, everything matters. Like, so what do you do? Where do I feel I have agency? We don't all have agency in everything, like, and we'll drive ourselves crazy trying to feel that we do. But where do I feel like I have agency and things matter? I think there's a lot of political agency on the local level, actually, on the hyper-local, and the local builds the global. You know, knowing your neighbors and organizing with your neighbors, and knowing local politics, and like being sort of real with the people in your life.
You still go to that same lake house where you were as a child, with the photo of your grandpa that isn't still on the wall anymore, but don't you still swim in the lake that you swam in when you were a kid that may or may not be polluted? Continuing to live your life and to have joy with the people that you have it with, and to enjoy the nature that you have, whatever level that nature is an act of freedom of expression and resistance and joy.
Yeah, maintaining relationships and having gratitude, but doing that with honesty too, right? My relationship to that place has changed. My conversations with my family have changed. Like, I mean, and some for the better. I don't feel quite as carefree about that place as I did as a kid.
The act of living a life and growing older and learning things changes a person in many ways.
Yeah. Laura, what you were saying about, still having joy and having gratitude for what we have, what is still beautiful, reminded me of this essay by Kenzaburo Oe, who is a Japanese novelist. He also wrote some essays called Hiroshima Notes, published in the 1960s. After the bombing, it was said that no grass would grow in Hiroshima for 75 years. And that wasn't true. The green came back quite quickly, and there are actually these trees around the city called Hibako Jumoko that were trees that survived or resprouted from the bombings, and now they're marked and they're sort of like respected in that way. And some of them are scarred or twisted because they were growing around wounds, but are still alive, which is kind of incredible. In one of his essays, Oe wrote about this, this idea that the grass wasn't going to grow, and now what do you do with the fact that you come to Hiroshima and there is a lot of grass and it's very beautiful and green? And he said, "There's no way of keeping one's balance in daily life and not be overwhelmed by crisis except to believe in the green grass if it sprouts from the scorched earth before our very eyes, and thus not to indulge in desperate imaginings so long as nothing abnormal happens. This is the only truly human way of living in Hiroshima. It takes a person of great care and insight to watch for any abnormality in the green grass while it grows abundantly and healthily. A person, that is, who is a humanist in the truest sense, neither too wildly desperate nor too vainly hopeful." And so what he's saying there, right, is like there was this fear of the genetic mutations of the plants and what sort of horrible things had been put in the natural world that were utterly changing them. And he's saying, we still should enjoy the grass and watch for the abnormality, right? Neither too wildly desperate nor too vainly hopeful. That feels like, I don't know, something to sit with.
Absolutely. And we've been through polycrises before. And in a lot of the discussion around the contemporary polycrisis, it's like, this is unprecedented. We'll never be able to get out of it. It's the death spiral of civilization. And in fact, we've been historically, through the history of humanity, through these massive polycrises. And you know what? We survived.
And we thrived, and we improved, and we grew. Yeah.
And we evolved our stories. And I mean, this actually goes right back to what we're talking about is, how do you find the joy, the gratitude, the positive? How do you improve how we communicate, how we take care of one another, by recognizing the the problems we have, shining a light on them, but then doing something about it. But, having that ability to see what might be negative, but also approach it in a positive manner. I think that's perfect and so important for everyone who's interested in telling better stories to grapple with. It's okay. I mean, you are the perfect example of taking the most painful subject at so many levels. I mean, you were from the personal and the familial and the community and the global. You hit all of the frames of context. You took the option of looking and still coming to it with positivity and joy.
And understanding and depth. One thing I've noticed just about spending the last hour with you is, and this is a good story to leave for the future, or value system to leave for the future, is the carefulness. So careful, so thorough.
Thank you. Yeah. I feel that we must be careful, right? That's it. There's power in story. So be accurate and be careful and be fair.
That is so true. And sometimes there are those out there right now who have been a lot less careful than you have been, to the detriment of a lot of people. And be careful, be kind to your stories, be careful with them, for they have power. And you've demonstrated that.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you for having us.
Welcome to my podcast.
Your first episode.
It's my first episode. I didn't know, but here we're going to launch.
Here we are. All
Well,
right.
welcome to Love Letters to the Future. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to like, subscribe.
Subscribe. Yes, subscribe so you can follow along and comment and do all the things.
Thank you so much, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.